I never really spent much time thinking about what happens after we die. It wasn't that I dismissed the idea completely. It just felt like one of those things you deal with when the time comes. Good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell. Simple. I never questioned what that actually meant. Never stopped to consider if it was really true. Life was busy enough without adding mysteries I couldn't solve. I was just a regular guy. Nothing extraordinary, nothing disastrous. I had a steady job, a small group of friends, and I went about my days the same as anyone else. Working, paying bills, thinking about what was coming next. Religion wasn't something I spent a lot of time on. I wasn't against it, but it didn't mean much to me either. If people wanted to believe, that was fine. It just wasn't part of my daily life. Looking back now, I can see how much I took for granted, the way I assumed I had all the time in the world to figure everything out. That was until the day everything changed. I never saw it coming. Life felt so routine, so predictable, that I never stopped to think about how fragile it really was. I couldn't have known that this would be the day I would find myself staring death in the face. It all started like any other day. I woke up, got dressed, went to work, and went through my usual motions. I didn't give much thought to anything beyond the immediate. There was no reason to think it would be different. No warning signs. I wasn't sick, I wasn't stressed, and I certainly wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. But death has a way of sneaking up on you, doesn't it? It doesn't ask for permission. It just happens. I remember leaving work, getting into my car, and starting my drive home. My mind was occupied with the usual stuff. What I was going to have for dinner, what show I'd watch that night, a couple of errands I needed to run over the weekend. Nothing that seemed important in the grand scheme of things. It was just another evening. But then, out of nowhere, it happened. A sharp, searing pain in my chest. It wasn't like anything I had felt before. Something deep inside me snapped, and in an instant, everything changed. The pain wasn't like any ordinary ache. There was no gradual buildup, no warning. It was sudden, intense, and felt like something inside me was ripping apart. My arms went weak, my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. But I didn't. I just went blank. I didn't even feel the impact when my car hit anything. Everything went dark and I couldn't feel anything anymore. I didn't know it then, but I had already crossed over. I don't remember the exact moment of the crash. I don't remember what happened to my body or the chaos that followed. But I do remember what happened afterward. I opened my eyes and I wasn't in my body anymore. I was somewhere else, above it all. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The wreck, the twisted metal, the glass scattered across the road. It was all too much. People were rushing toward the scene calling for help, but I didn't feel any urgency. I didn't feel anything at all. I just watched, detached from it all. And then I saw myself, my body, lying motionless in the car, blood on my forehead, chest barely moving. I should have felt fear or confusion, but I didn't. I was just watching. It was like watching a scene unfold in a movie, except this wasn't a movie. This was real. I could see the paramedics arrive, rushing toward my car, trying to revive me. One of them was doing chest compressions, another was pulling out equipment, all working frantically to bring me back. But I knew I wasn't coming back, at least not yet. I wasn't in pain, but I wasn't at peace either. I was confused, disoriented. I knew I was dead, but somehow I was still aware, still thinking, still observing everything happening below me. This wasn't what I had expected. I thought when you die, you simply cease to exist or move on to something else. But this was something entirely different. I was still here, floating above it all, watching people try to save a life that was already lost. Before I could make sense of it, something changed. There was a pull, not physical, but strong, an invisible force, like something was guiding me away from the scene. As I was pulled, everything else started to fade. The voices, the sirens, the lights. It all began to disappear into the distance. The world around me was shrinking, and I was being drawn into something. And for the first time, I felt fear. A deep, unnerving fear. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a dream. This was real. I tried to turn, to see where I was going, but there was nothing to see. No ground beneath me, no sky above me. Just an endless, suffocating darkness stretching in every direction. It felt like I was being swallowed by the void. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I tried to move, but I was frozen. There was nothing to anchor me, nothing to hold on to. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A light. At first it was just a faint glow, like a distant star, but as I moved toward it, it grew brighter, warmer, and somehow it felt alive. But with the light, there was something else, something darker, a presence, something cold that made my skin crawl. Whispers filled the air, though I couldn't understand them. They weren't coming from the light, but from the shadows surrounding it, moving just beyond my reach. It felt wrong. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel eyes watching me, unseen figures lurking in the dark, waiting. I couldn't see them clearly, but I knew they weren't human. The darkness was alive with something I couldn't explain, and it terrified me. I tried to turn away, to escape, but I couldn't move. I was trapped. The darkness pressed in on me, its weight heavy and suffocating. I could feel the figures in the shadows now, surrounding me, watching, waiting. Their presence was palpable, like they were closing in on me, and I could sense the hostility in the air. They weren't just observing, they were expecting something. I didn't know what, but I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't where I was meant to be. Panic began to rise inside me, but before I could fully process it, the light ahead of me exploded. The burst of light was so powerful, so intense, that it shattered everything in its path. The darkness recoiled, the whispers silenced in an instant, and the figures that had been surrounding me vanished, as if they were nothing more than smoke in the wind. The overwhelming force of the light pushed the shadows back, and for the first time since I had died, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. It wasn't just light anymore, it was something more, something greater. It enveloped me, wrapping me in warmth and calm, and in that moment, I knew that I was no longer alone. And then, I heard it, a voice. It was strong yet gentle, full of power, but drenched in love. A voice that didn't just speak, it resonated within me as if it had always been there, waiting to be heard. Do not be afraid. In that moment, I knew exactly who it was, even though I had never really considered him before, even though I had never truly believed. I knew it was Jesus speaking to me, and that knowledge hit me harder than anything else I had experienced so far. I had spent my whole life indifferent to him, yet here he was, waiting for me, calling me by name. In that instant, I realized something that shook me to my core. I had never truly believed in Jesus, not really. I had always lived as if it didn't matter, as if I had all the time in the world to figure it out. But he had always known me. He knew who I was, and in that moment, he was offering me a chance. But a chance for what? I didn't know. But I could feel the urgency, the invitation, pulling me forward. And I knew one thing for sure: my life, my choices, my beliefs, nothing would ever be the same again. The light around me intensified, and I felt myself moving toward it, not by choice, but by something beyond my understanding. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I couldn't resist. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was weightless, floating, drawn toward something that felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. But as I moved closer to the light, I felt something else, a presence, dark and heavy, lingering just beyond my reach. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it watching me, and it made the peaceful light feel even more overwhelming. As I continued to move forward, I could sense a change in the atmosphere. The darkness wasn't just around me, it was closing in, like something was trying to keep me from reaching the light. The farther I went, the more I could feel its presence. It wasn't a threat I could fight, but something I knew I had to face. The whispers returned, louder this time, sharp and menacing. "You don't belong here," they hissed. "It's too late for you." Panic began to rise again, but I forced myself to push forward, the light becoming brighter and more tangible. I was close now, very close, and that's when I saw it. A figure stepping out from the light, walking toward me with authority. As the figure drew closer, I recognized him immediately. It was Jesus. There was no mistaking it. The light around him radiated warmth and truth, a presence so powerful, yet so full of love, that it made everything else fade into the background. The whispers and the darkness ceased to matter. Nothing could overshadow him. And when he looked at me, it wasn't with condemnation, but with understanding, as if he had always known me, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The heaviness in my chest lifted, replaced by a deep, overwhelming peace. I wanted to speak, to ask questions, but words failed me. I didn't need to speak to know that everything I had believed, everything I had thought I knew, was suddenly irrelevant. The truth was standing before me, in the form of this divine presence. He didn't need to say anything to make me understand. His very being spoke volumes. In that moment, I realized what had been missing from my life all along. I had spent so many years searching for answers in the wrong places, and now I understood. This was the answer. Jesus was the answer. The warmth of his presence was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was a deep, soul-level peace that filled every part of me, making everything else seem insignificant in comparison. His gaze was full of love, but also a deep understanding, as if he could see everything I had ever done, every mistake, every moment of doubt. And yet, there was no judgment, no condemnation, just a quiet, knowing acceptance. It was as if he had always been there, waiting for me to see the truth. As I stood there, overwhelmed by his presence, Jesus spoke. His voice was gentle, yet it carried the weight of eternity. "Daniel," he said, and it felt like he was speaking directly to my soul. There was no doubt in my mind. He knew me. He had always known me. And in that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. I had never truly believed in him. Not really. But he had always known me, and he was here now, showing me the truth. He didn't need to say anything more. The realization alone was enough. His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and for the first time, I saw the truth clearly. I had never sought him, never truly acknowledged his existence, but he had always been there, always waiting. And now he was offering me something I had never even considered. A chance, a choice. But what did that mean? What was I supposed to do with it? I stood there unsure as the weight of my life, my choices, and everything I had ignored washed over me. Then Jesus stepped closer, and I felt a wave of warmth, comfort, and truth envelop me. His presence filled the space around us, and it was as if the entire universe had shifted. Everything that had once felt important, the things I had pursued in life, the distractions I had focused on, faded away. In that moment, I understood. It wasn't about my past. It wasn't about the mistakes I had made or the doubts I had carried. It was about him, about following him. That was the only thing that truly mattered. Jesus looked at me with an expression that conveyed both love and sorrow. "You've been seeking answers," he said, and that shook me to my core. Seeking? I hadn't thought I had been. I had lived my life thinking I was fine, thinking I didn't need anything more. But as his words sank in, memories began to surface. Moments late at night when I wondered if there was something more. Moments when I turned away from the conversations about faith, about God. Deep down, I had been seeking all along. I just hadn't known it. As Jesus spoke, I felt a stirring inside me, a sense of clarity I had never experienced before. He was offering me the truth about life, death, and what lay beyond it. And for the first time, I could see it. I understood it. This wasn't just about religion or beliefs. It was about something deeper, about knowing him, about following him. And that realization left me breathless. This was the choice I had been given. This was the chance. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing. My life would never be the same again. Suddenly, everything around me shifted. I was no longer standing in the light. The vibrant, all-encompassing glow that had surrounded me faded away, and I found myself standing on solid ground. The sky stretched out above me, filled with colors I couldn't even begin to describe, beautiful beyond anything I had seen before. And there beside me stood Jesus, still radiating peace, still unchanged. But there were others now, people of all kinds, moving toward something, toward the light, toward him. Some walked with purpose, others with uncertainty, but all were drawn to the same source. I turned to Jesus, still processing everything, trying to understand what was happening. "Where are we?" I asked, confusion creeping into my voice. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply lifted his hand, and the scene around us shifted again. I could see people, countless souls, all different from one another, walking, kneeling, standing. Some looked lost, some seemed in awe, others were rejoicing. And that's when I realized something profound. There were no divisions here, no races, no borders, just people, just souls. I looked around at the faces, some familiar, some completely foreign, and I saw no separation. There were no lines drawn between us, no markers of who belonged where. Everyone was simply here, existing, drawn toward the same light. It was then that I understood. The divisions that existed on Earth, based on race, nationality, culture, had no place here. Here, it was only about who we were, who we chose to follow, the light, the truth. It wasn't about where we came from. It was about where we were headed. I turned to Jesus, the question forming in my mind before I even asked it. Where do white people go after they die? It felt strange asking, almost irrelevant, but I needed to know. Jesus didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with a steady gaze, then asked me a question of his own. Where do you think? His tone wasn't harsh, just gentle, as if encouraging me to think deeper. I hesitated, unsure how to answer, but his words lingered in the air, demanding reflection. I thought for a moment, the weight of the question pressing on me. Heaven, I finally answered, not sure what he would say. Jesus nodded slightly, tilting his head. Some, he replied, but his expression didn't change. I felt my stomach tighten, a sense of unease growing. And the others? I asked, my voice quieter now. His gaze remained steady, calm, but there was something in his eyes, something deeper that made my heart sink. He didn't need to answer. I already knew. They didn't go toward the light. They didn't belong there, no matter who they were. Jesus turned his gaze back toward the people moving in every direction, some toward the light, others standing still, others walking away. I watched, still struggling to make sense of it all, as he spoke again. There are no divisions here like there were on earth. No borders, no nationalities, no skin colors. His words carried a weight I hadn't fully understood before. The divisions that had mattered so much in life, so much of our identity on earth, didn't matter here, not in the least. The only thing that mattered was the condition of the heart. I felt my stomach churn as the truth of his words sank in. It wasn't about race or history or any of the things that separated us on earth. It was about our hearts, our choices. Everything I had thought mattered, everything I had believed was important, was meaningless here. It was a sobering realization. People didn't go toward the light because of where they came from or what they looked like. They went because of who they chose to follow. The light was drawing them in, and that choice, more than anything else, defined where they would spend eternity. I looked back at the crowds, my heart heavy. Some of the people moving toward the light had faces filled with peace, while others seemed hesitant, unsure. But what about the ones who didn't move? What about the ones who stood frozen, staring at the light, but not walking toward it? I turned to Jesus, my voice barely above a whisper. What happens to them? I asked, my chest tightening. Jesus' expression didn't waver, but there was sorrow in his eyes. He simply said, because of their choices. The weight of those words hit me like a tidal wave. It was never about being good enough. It was about choosing him. The realization settled over me with a painful clarity. Some of the people who hesitated, who didn't step toward the light, weren't necessarily bad people. In fact, many of them had lived good lives. They had tried to do the right thing, helped others when they could, and lived decently. But it wasn't enough. They had never truly chosen him. They had never acknowledged the truth, never fully embraced the path he offered. And because of that, they stood still, caught between two worlds, unable to move forward. I looked at Jesus again, my voice trembling. But some of them were good. They didn't hurt anyone. They lived decent lives. Why aren't they moving toward the light? He met my gaze with quiet compassion. Being good is not the same as knowing me. His words struck me like lightning. I had spent so much of my life believing that being a good person was enough, that living a moral life would be the ticket to peace. But now, standing before him, I saw the truth. It was about knowing him. It was about choosing him, not just being a good person. I felt my heart drop. It was a hard truth to swallow. The idea that simply living a good life, doing the right things, wasn't enough. That all the effort we put into being good, by human standards, didn't count unless we had truly known Jesus, unless we had chosen him. That was the choice that defined everything. That was the choice that mattered. I could feel the weight of it, the gravity of what it meant, and it made everything else feel insignificant. This was what eternity depended on, knowing him, following him. I turned back to the people, watching as some moved toward the light, their faces filled with peace, while others still hesitated. Some stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Others looked around in confusion. A few seemed to reject it outright. But then, my attention shifted to those who were being pulled away. They were drifting backward, away from the light, as if something invisible was pulling them into the darkness. I swallowed hard. What happens to them? I asked, the question rising from deep within me. Jesus' answer was gentle, but firm. They chose a life without me. and now they have eternity without me. My chest tightened as the truth of his words washed over me. I couldn't breathe for a moment. The weight of it all was too much to bear. I had spent my whole life thinking that being a good person, doing the right thing, was enough. But here, in this place, I saw that it wasn't about how good you were or how moral. It was about who you chose to follow, who you gave your heart to. Jesus had always been the way, the truth, the life, and it was only through him that anyone could find peace. Without him, there was only darkness. Without him, there was nothing. I looked around, seeing faces filled with sorrow, regret, and some with defiance. But the one thing they all had in common was that they had rejected him. They had made their choice long before they arrived here, and now it was too late. The path they had chosen on earth had led them here, away from the light, away from peace. It was a fate I never thought I could understand until now. It wasn't about the good things they had done or the life they had lived. It was about the choice they made, the choice to reject Jesus. I turned back to Jesus, my voice shaking. What about the ones who never had a chance to know you? The ones who were raised differently? Who were taught something else? I asked, my heart aching for those who never had the opportunity to hear the truth. He looked at me with deep compassion, his eyes full of love and authority. Everyone is given a chance. No one is without excuse. The weight of his words struck me deeply. No one was truly without the opportunity to seek him. Everyone had a moment, a choice. Some had ignored it, some had rejected it, but everyone had been given a chance to know the truth. And for those who rejected it, their fate was sealed. I looked back at the souls in the darkness. Some of them looked desperate, as if they wished they could go back and change their decisions. Others seemed defiant, refusing to accept where they had ended up. I felt my heart ache for them, for the ones who had chosen this path. I turned to Jesus, my voice barely a whisper. What happens to them? I asked, my eyes filled with sorrow. Jesus' expression softened, but there was a quiet finality in his voice as he answered. They remain where they chose to be. The gravity of his words sank in, and I felt my whole body tense. The truth was undeniable. They had chosen this. They had chosen to live their lives without him, and now they were lost. There was no turning back. There was no second chance. The time to choose had passed, and now they had to face the eternity that awaited them. I couldn't help but feel the deep sorrow of it all. It was a fate I never wanted to see, never wanted to imagine, but it was real, and it was happening to people every day. I felt my whole being trembling as I realized something even more chilling. I had almost been one of them. If I had died without knowing Jesus, without making the choice to follow him, I would have been lost, just like the rest of them. I would have been pulled into the darkness, away from the light. I would have spent eternity separated from him. I stood there feeling the weight of that truth pressed down on me. And then I realized, this was my second chance. This was my opportunity to choose. I had been given a glimpse into eternity, a glimpse into the reality of what happens after death, and now I knew what I had to do. I turned to Jesus, my voice shaking with the urgency of the moment. Then what happens next? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Jesus looked at me with love, but also with a quiet determination. Now you must see what happens to those who refuse their last chance. And in that instant, everything around me shifted again. The light that had surrounded me began to fade, and I found myself standing in a new place, one I could barely comprehend. I stood there, my mind racing, as I took in the scene before me. The light had faded, and in its place was something else, something that filled me with dread. I saw a rift, a division, not physical but spiritual, and on one side, there were people standing in the light, filled with peace. But on the other side, I saw darkness, a thick, oppressive fog, and the figures within it were twisted and distorted, filled with regret and sorrow. They reached toward the light, but they couldn't move forward. They were trapped, separated, lost forever. I turned to Jesus, my chest tight with the weight of what I was seeing. What am I looking at? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His voice was steady, filled with a deep certainty. The truth about judgment, he said, and in that moment, I understood. Judgment wasn't just about whether we had lived good lives. It was about the choices we made, the choice to follow him or to reject him. And for those who had rejected him, there was no going back. There was no second chance. The consequences were eternal. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of it all. I had always assumed that judgment was about being good or bad, about the things we did in life. But now, I saw the truth. Judgment was about who we followed. It was about whether we chose Jesus, whether we made him the center of our lives. I looked around at the faces in the darkness, seeing the regret and the sorrow on their faces. They had chosen their path, and now they had to live with the consequences. I turned back to Jesus, my voice barely a whisper. Why do some people end up here? Why are they separated? I asked. He met my gaze, his eyes filled with both love and sorrow. Because their choices have already been made, he said. And in that moment, I understood. The choices we make in life, what we choose to believe, who we choose to follow, determine our eternity. It's not about our past, our mistakes, or how good we were. It's about Jesus. It's about whether we choose to follow him. I stood there, my mind racing, as I realized the full weight of what I had just witnessed. This wasn't just some dream. This was reality. The reality of life, death, and what happens afterward. The choices we make today have eternal consequences. And in that moment, I understood what I needed to do. I had to choose. I had to follow Jesus, because that was the only way to have eternal life. That was the only way to find peace. And I knew with every fiber of my being that nothing would ever be the same again. I looked at Jesus, my heart full of gratitude and awe. I will follow you, I whispered. And in that moment, everything changed.